Hi, everyone. We are talking this week about special populations and trauma, individuals and groups who are particularly at risk for developing PTSD or trauma-related symptoms because of high rates of trauma exposure. And I'm going to talk with you today about my experience working some with refugees here in Rwanda. Our agency has a contract to work directly with individuals who are in refugee camps in East Africa through virtual means. So we're working virtually with some individuals who can speak good English. They are actually enrolled in university. In addition, I work with people who work in the camp, so people who work for an agency like UNHCR or an NGO and are directly working in the camps. And often these individuals present with secondary trauma symptoms from exposure to the refugee stories. So I've had some experience here. In addition, we hosted a refugee family before we moved overseas, and that was quite enlightening. And in a ministry I was involved in Ethiopia, I worked with refugees there as well. So we are going to go into a PowerPoint now and go through some definitions, and we'll start with some broad statistical information and then go more into my experience in Rwanda, and then some information about working with refugees if you ever have that opportunity in the US. So a refugee is fairly clearly defined because in 1951, after World War II, there was an international convention where the refugee status was defined. They are protected by international law, and the host country that they go into, refugees go into, are primarily responsible for the refugees they take in. In addition, the UNHCR keeps track of how many refugees there are at any given time and ensures that they are being taken care of. At least around 80 million people in 2009 were reported to have this refugee status, and these are individuals who are forcibly displaced from their homes due to conflict or violence or human rights violations, sometimes also disasters, individuals who cannot be in their own country. 85% of refugees are actually hosted in developing countries. Often these are countries surrounding the country, so surrounding countries often host refugees, and about 100 million have been displaced in the last 10 years. In terms of the US, in 2020, they estimated 31,250 refugees were settled in the US, and most of those refugees were in Texas, Washington State, New York, and California. Since 2002, most refugees came from Burma, Iraq, and Somalia. However, in that particular year, most of them came from the DR Congo, which doesn't surprise me, as it's a bordering country of Rwanda, and they've certainly had a lot of socio-political unrest. High levels of trauma exposure and PTSD are common in refugees. And a meta-analysis article in 2009 found that over 30% of refugees qualified for a PTSD diagnosis. However, that may be a bit low. In another study, as many as 75% of children were found to qualify for a PTSD diagnosis. Very high rates. So why is this? COMEG identifies risk factors throughout the refugee life cycle. So in pre-migration, during flight, and upon arrival, there are all times where there is opportunities for trauma exposure for a refugee. Often these individuals are coming from countries that are not stable, and so they may be exposed to violence or have a secondary exposure to trauma because of the communities that they live in, and individuals in their family and community talking about the stories of trauma. So if they are in a if they're in a family where there is a lot of conflict outside, those stories are brought in, and children are then raised, for example, growing up with stories of violence and trauma and loss. Of course, during flight there are high incidences of trauma. These are when people need to escape their country, right? So one of the big risk factors during this time is separation from loved ones. You often hear about children, particularly who have been separated from their families. Some of the most incredible stories of escape I've heard here in Rwanda, because in '94 there was a war and genocide, and many people who survived actually escaped through hiding and through incredible means to get out of danger. In addition, I have a client right now who was raised in a refugee camp without his parents, and he says that there was a whole group of them that grew up together, that raised each other. And so this is quite common, because many children are separated from their parents or taken across the border by another family and then never reunited. So this is a very, very sad reality for many families and refugees. Upon arrival in the host country, there is an opportunity for prevention, because many of the things that refugees experience that can cause further trauma include things like discrimination or lack of supports. So a preventative techniques such as education and training to prevent these kind of incidences are essential to help for when refugees land, for those who are greeting them to be experienced and ready to respond in a culturally competent way. In addition, I wanted to mention the cross-cultural adjustment that occurs when you are in a country, especially for those who are coming from the countries mentioned, like Burma or Eritrea, into a country like America, whose culture is completely different. There are cross-cultural adjustment factors that are important for you to keep in mind if you ever work with these countries, with this population. There is a word actually used among individuals who are living outside of their own country. So not only refugees, but all kinds of migrants or international workers even. Even in my community, we use this word saudade, which is a 17th century Portuguese word that means a longing for what no longer is. So it's almost a type of grief for sights and sounds and smells and tastes that you can no longer access because you are in the same place. I took a couple of snapshots from my own photo album just to demonstrate, even for us who certainly are not in this refugee status, but we are living cross-culturally. This is a photo of my children when we first arrived from the airport in Ethiopia 8 years ago. And I love this picture because children so clearly capture the emotions that all of us are having when we maybe arrive in a place and are faced with the reality that, wow, this is our new home and it's so different. This doesn't feel comfortable to me, right? You may experience, individuals may experience anger, or they may experience confusion, or just this feeling of being extremely overwhelmed. So I took these images just so that you could have a mental image of some of the sensory differences, inputs that are very different than the US. So these again are pictures when we arrived in Ethiopia that struck me as very different. The smell of coffee and the way they make bread over the fires tastes amazing, but the smells are very different. The sights and sounds from churches around the country are constant, and they take some adjusting to, because they aren't quite what one is used to coming from the United States. Even the animals that you see on the streets, and you don't see monkeys and ostriches in the US normally when you're driving around. And on the school campus, we had a tortoise or several tortoises walking around. These are new sensory inputs that are both exciting, but can also cause a feeling of not being quite, things just not feeling quite right. So this is certainly the experience as well for refugees. I've talked to many individuals who say when they arrive in the US, for example, they notice the lack of people. In East Africa and in many countries, the streets are full, and there are people everywhere because many people walk, their homes are small, and they're outside living in community. Often when people arrive in the US, even in a big city, people are either in a car or away in their homes. And that's one of the biggest things that they say is an adjustment, sensory, on a sensory level, because they don't see as many people. In addition, shopping, of course, is very different. This is not my experience every day. I don't go to the local markets, but I do once in a while. But for many people, shopping in a market is the way they find their goods. They are negotiating. Again, it just is packed with things, and you're talking with people and other people within your community to negotiate and trade and talk about what you need. In the U.S., the experience of shopping is quite different. There's thousands and thousands of options, and maybe no one to help you figure out what exactly you might need. So all of these things can add to the adjustment of someone coming from another country into America. So it's important to keep these things in mind when you're working with individuals. We're going to talk for a minute about refugees in Rwanda specifically. Rwanda is in a unique situation because in 1994, there was a genocide here, and many, many people fled to the neighboring countries of Congo, Burundi, Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, and other countries, but specifically those neighboring countries. There is this neighboring relationship between all these small countries in East Africa. And now Rwanda is quite stable. So they feel thankful to the countries around them that took care of their citizens during the armed conflict in 1994. And they have opened up their borders now to countries that need a safe place to land individuals who need to flee. So, for example, in the DR Congo and in Burundi, there's been a lot of political and humanitarian unrest in recent years, and Rwanda has opened up its doors even without a cap to these countries. So this is an example of what I talked about earlier, that 85% of refugees are hosted by countries in developing countries. Hosted by developing countries. So Rwanda is certainly an example of that. There are currently 30,000 refugees in Rwanda, well, as of 2019, and in an interview, I talked a couple years ago to someone from the UN who said, we too were once refugees. So again, this idea of it's our turn to host. I wanted to make you all aware that a couple weeks ago, if you may have seen this in the news, that Mount Nyiragongo in Goma, which is just 60 miles from where I live in Kigali, erupted in a massive explosion. This is a very active volcano, and in the last time it erupted seriously was in 2002. At the time, it completely destroyed the city of Goma, which you can see there, and the individuals there still are recovering from that eruption. Well, a couple of weeks ago, without any expectation, the mountain erupted again. And fortunately, this time the lava went away from the main city. And so the individuals have been able to return. But at the time, it created a huge crisis. And not only did the eruption create crisis, but there were ongoing earthquakes for days and for up to about 2 weeks afterwards. In fact, last time we met, I was still feeling ongoing tremors from earthquakes, even in Kigali. So we didn't have any big earthquakes, but we could feel the tremors from the explosion 60 miles away. At least 8,000 people fled into Rwanda after the explosion, and 450,000 people fled the city. So you can imagine something like this, how this would allow for things like separation of families and people not knowing which direction to go into. In addition, there were urgent needs that came into NGOs and us here in Kigali. We got calls saying there's a need for sleeping mats and blankets and food and hygiene kits to care for these individuals who were smashed into churches and schools and anywhere Rwanda could kind of put them, because of course they were not expecting 800 or 8,000 people to come across the border. So this is an example of, for those of you who have studied the psychological first aid or disaster response, this is a perfect example of the needs that arise unexpectedly and the need for disaster response workers. At the time, just a couple weeks ago, the UNHCR said there is a high need for psychological care in hosting areas as requested by doctors at the regional hospital, since so many people are coming forward with signs of trauma. So one of the important things that is happening here is training individuals in psychological first aid, training locals who speak the language to respond to disasters like this. So hopefully next time we'll be even more prepared to respond. This is a photo by a father of a friend of mine who was on the border in a city called Ghassini, which is a popular weekend retreat for many of us in Kigali. The sky just lit up in this bright red. Jaap, who I know is a photographer, a Dutch photographer, and he allowed me to share this photo with you about what it looks like when an explosion happens. We're going to move into refugees in the US. So refugees desire a permanent placement. Every refugee that I've talked to who is living in a camp, they hope that that is a temporary placement for them, and they desire a permanent placement. They especially desire to be placed in a country with so many resources like the US. And those who go to these permanent placements, like we talked about earlier, are going through an adjustment. John Barry is a researcher who has done a lot of research on protective factors and integration, bicultural integration for refugees specifically. And he has found that integrated involvement in the new society and the heritage culture is really a protective factor for individuals who are adjusting. So he says identifying more with one's ethnic group is not conceptually nor empirically opposed to identifying with one's national society. So again, one of the things that you want to keep in mind if you ever have the chance to work with refugees is they're in this process of identity formation, and not even for first generation refugees, but even for those who are adjusting after they may have lived in a country for a little while. So second generation, the children of refugees. And so you want to promote opportunities for individuals to participate in both cultures. Risk factors, as I talked about a bit before, include discrimination and lack of cultural competence among teachers, counselors, community workers, those who are receiving the refugees. In addition, isolation and previous trauma certainly contribute to a risk factor for a refugee. So you want to be aware that refugees come from very different cultural backgrounds, and just to be curious and encourage both ethnic heritage identity and opportunities for them to share their culture with you, but also helping to find ways for them to integrate into the new society in which they live. This, of course, agrees with other bicultural identity development models and things like that that encourage recognition of strength in both cultures. There are a few therapies that have been found especially to be effective for work with refugees. One of those is narrative exposure therapy. It's proven to be a very effective treatment for refugees, and it's easily implemented within schools and outpatient clinics. Narrative exposure therapy there's a lot of work with timelines and contextualizing their story within the larger story. So they talk about beginnings and endings, and they not only talk about the trauma experiences, but also positive events. And so it's an opportunity, especially for individuals who come from a culture that values narrative and story and community, to talk about their story in a context, and allows for opportunity to see, where does this story go next and who do I want to become? So especially for those who speak the language well, narrative exposure therapy is quite effective. In addition, the creative arts therapies have been found with a trauma focus have been especially shown especially effective with refugees. So these include techniques such as music therapy and creative play and drama, even the use of puppets and storytelling. These allow, again, for individuals who may not even speak the language to have an opportunity to work through their trauma, because the creative arts both have opportunities for self-regulation and techniques, as well as expressive or storytelling techniques specifically regarding their trauma. So these programs have been found to be quite effective with refugees. So if we were in person, I would challenge you to think about how you might use a creative art therapy to encourage bicultural integration. As thinking about how important that is, how could you use a creative art technique to facilitate that? Walsham and Goldrick talk about community trauma therapies and loss after a traumatic event, and from a community perspective. These are especially effective and important for individuals coming from a communal culture. So I wanted to recognize their work. So they talk about the importance of shared acknowledgement and shared experience. So again, the individual experience isn't the only thing happening. As a community, what have individuals lost as a community? In addition, so that grief work that we know is always a part of trauma work. But then in addition, when looking forward, the reorganization of family is important to consider when there has been community loss. So recognizing, what does the new family structure look like, and how is that different from before? And what are the new relationships that you might be investing in as a community? John Barry, as I mentioned earlier, is a cross-cultural researcher. And if you have time to watch this YouTube video, I found it really interesting. He talks more about this double engagement and how this has been so effective for refugees who are adjusting to a new culture. In addition, he talks about the benefits of multiculturalism for a society. So I encourage you to watch this video. Finally, I want to talk about the role of hope. Nisa Green did her dissertation on this topic specifically, the role of hope in resettlement for refugees, East African refugees specifically. And so I've just taken a few of her findings and highlights from the interviews that she had with East African refugees resettling. And this theme of hope kept coming up. So here are a few of her findings for you to consider. And hope, again, I know I've talked about this in class, but is a construct in mental health that includes agency or goal-directed activity and energy, plans to meet goals. So finding opportunities for agency, to develop agency in our clients is a part of hope. In addition, hope is a virtue in faith traditions. So in the Bible, we know that talking about trust in God and expectation for His goodness to be revealed is a foundation of Christian faith. And so we know that we can connect with this idea of hope in our religious faith tradition. And finally, Terry Watson talks about how hope is connected to the ethical principle of beneficence. And I love this, that as part of our role as clinicians is to promote health and well-being in society. And this is a very hopeful perspective, isn't it? So I want to end by reading an Eritrean proverb that Nisa Green highlights in her dissertation. And it says, "If you lose some money, nothing is lost. If you lose some friends, something is lost. If you lose hope, everything is lost." And I just think about the individuals that I've seen who have adjusted to such a new culture, and how hope is such an important ingredient in their process. So thank you, and I hope this was helpful.